with things like funding the Ukraine war with Russia. Please explain to people what that means and why we're sending so much money over to Ukraine.
So let's start with that. Let's start with the military-industrial complex.
Okay.
What is it? Who is it? It is these massive defense corporations who make all these different weapon systems, from the smallest to the most powerful nuclear weapons and missiles. When we are at war, they make a lot of money. When politicians, even if we're not at war but are threatening that we may go to war, they make a lot of money. And these decisions are not made within the context of, hey, what does our military actually need? What do we need to ensure that our military is ready to defend our country and our national security interests? It is very often what members of Congress are advocating for, even more than the military is asking for sometimes, because of those cozy relationships with the military-industrial complex, with these massive defense contractors and their lobbyists.
I'm president of Local 751, Local A of District 751 of the Machinists Union. We have an important election coming up this November 2nd, and we have to get fired up. Are we fired up? We're here to get Patty Murray reelected. I can talk to you how she's the right choice because of work on education, workforce development, and for what she's done for our veterans. But I want to focus on something that I probably don't even need to remind you about. She is our champion when it comes to winning the tanker contract. When the Pentagon tried to give the tanker contract to a French company to outsource our tax dollars and our jobs to stimulate the European economy, Patty Murray stood up. She stood with us at rallies across the street at our Machinist Union Hall, on the assembly lines, and on the Senate floor.
The Air Force tomorrow will explain why it granted a $40 billion military tanker contract to Europe's consortium that builds the Airbus and not to Boeing. Senator Patty Murray from Washington State, representing many Boeing employees as her constituents. Well, you know, let me ask you this, because you and I have talked about free trade before, as it's practiced by this administration and the previous. You're a free trader, right?
I voted for trade agreements, but I believe in enforcing them, and that's one of the problems with this deal.
But, Senator, I've got to say to you, we haven't enforced a trade agreement in this country in 30 years. We are being run over by people who are acting in their national interest, in the interest of their employees, and this government and both political parties continue to ignore the American worker. Is it finally a place to draw the line, Senator?
Democrats and Republicans can't agree on anything. This issue of putting our country in a continual state of war is supported by leaders in both parties and the majority of people in both parties. And it's directly tied to the military-industrial complex's influence and tied to people who, you know, want to act and look tough, but aren't asking the most important questions like, okay, if we do this, will this help the American people or hurt the American people? If we vote to, send these billions of dollars to Ukraine, is that strengthening our national security or undermining it?
And then in 2014, there was a coup in Ukraine that was completely led by the West. I don't know if you've ever heard, but I think I sent you actually once the tape of Gideon Rose, who was the editor for Foreign Affairs magazine on the old Stephen Colbert report.
We've got a battle. The Ukraine, some of them want to go into the EU, the European Union, right? And some of them want to stay with Russia. If the Ukraine's not in Europe right now, what continent is it on?
Well, it's part of Eurasia, but it's part of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet bloc. It's basically Robin to Russia's Batman. And the challenge here is to try to attract it to the West, to get it to flip sides.
So the rebels in the streets, what are they fighting for?
They're fighting for a better future. Countries have a development...
That sounds like a political speech.
No, but it's actually true. Countries have to develop over time. And Ukraine, basically, after the end of the Soviet Union, faced two tracks. It could stay a sort of stagnant, corrupt, authoritarian country tied to Russia, or it could essentially join the West. It could modernize, liberalize, become a democracy. At the last minute, when it looked like it was going to trade up from its sort of abusive relationship with its boyfriend from the hood to a nice yuppie.
You're not loading these choices in any way whatsoever.
It's actually true. When it looked like it was going to trade up to a better environment, at the last minute, Putin offered a bribe.
How much?
$15 billion.
That's a lot of cash,
It's a lot of cash. And the president, who himself was tied to the old elites and the eastern part of the country with ties to Russia, decided to back off the change and go join Russia.
Do you know how many pirate-themed restaurants you can buy with $15 billion?
The problem was the western parts of the country and the younger parts of the country and the more modern liberal parts of the country basically knew that they had no future being Russia's vassal. So they took to the streets.
Is America taking sides in this in any way? If these people, the rebels are winning right now, right?
Yes, just recently.
Why isn't Obama spiking the ball in the end zone and calling Putin and saying, hey, you might have won the medal count, but we won the country count, biatch?
It's actually a very good question, and the answer is that we don't want Russia to intervene and kick over the table like a game of Risk and take Ukraine back. And so
would they do that? Could he send in troops?
Yes, he could. So we are choosing...
Does Ukraine have any troops of their own? Would they fight back?
Yes, but we don't want this to escalate, and we don't want Russia to crack down. So we want to basically distract Russia. Oh, look, you have the highest medal count. Oh, you did really well. And focus on the Olympics.
Here's a shiny object. We'll just take an entire country away from you.
Holy shit.
Now,
isn't that funny?
There's a power vacuum right now.
There's a power vacuum. The opposition is all together, which it's easy to agree on getting rid of the bad old regime and much harder to create a stable country in which everybody compromises and moves forward. Ukraine is basically choosing its future between two completely different courses of action, and we're trying to blur that choice so the old boyfriend doesn't get too upset when it makes the right choice towards us.
So it's just all these George Soros-funded NGOs were funding the militias on the ground who were overthrowing the government. And then there's a tape of Victoria Nuland, who's was at the State Department at the time, one of the top people at the State Department, and she was basically talking about who would be the new government that took over, who America didn't want in, who we did want in the new government.
Screen at Poroshenko's campaign headquarters sends a clear message. Exit polls give him well over the crucial figure of 50%. These are not official figures. All the same, they suggest strongly that the billionaire may be poised to win this election outright.
They show with very small discrepancies that the election is over after the first round and the country has a new president.
Rarely have Ukrainians gone to the polls with so much enthusiasm. In the capital, long queues formed as people waited to cast their vote for the new president. For many, this was the most important election since Ukraine left the Soviet Union.
I think it will be a big step to stabilize the situation in the country.
I expect life to be better. I expect peace and unity in the country.
Petro Poroshenko has promised to reform the economy and fight corruption. His role in the protests against the former regime give him credibility. Crucially, he presents himself as a unifying candidate who can reconcile the east and west of the country. In the east, where pro-Russia separatists opposed the vote, it was a very different picture. Ballot boxes turned into rubbish bins. Only about 1/4 of polling stations were able to open, and separatists intimidated voters and election officials.
Believe it or not, it's been nearly 4 years since the first 737 MAX took to the skies in a test flight. And for more than 7 months, the MAX has been grounded worldwide in the wake of 2 accidents which killed hundreds. Boeing is counting on that grounding to be lifted fairly soon.
Is having a big impact on Boeing stock. Our business correspondent Marley Keaton is here with more.
Adrian, shares of Boeing plunged yesterday following reports that one of its planes crashed in southern China, of course, with 132 people on board. We saw the stock dive as much as 9% after the crash happened. You can see, if you look at the graph there on your screen, just a straight line down as it plunged.
From the U.S. Can see years before, obviously, Russia's invasion in Ukraine, this anti-Russia sentiment has been building up by the permanent Washington establishment and laying the groundwork, and this was the opportunity that they saw.
Russia, possible collusion, Russian hacked our election. Here comes a big change. Because all of a sudden, Trump, Russian possible collusion, Russian collusion.
Trump, Russia, possible collusion.
Trump, Russian possible collusion. Trump, the Russians, collusion.
Collusion with the Russians. Trump, Russia, possible collusion. Trump, Russia, possible collusion. Prove collusion. Prove collusion.
Was there collusion?
Absolutely.
Trump, Russia, possible collusion. 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 Trump, Russia, possible collusion.
But President Trump appeared so confident of what Durham would find, he openly pressured the special counsel to release his findings before the 2020 election. Regardless, the report is now here. It has dropped, and it might not have produced everything of what some Republicans hoped for. It is, regardless, devastating to the FBI, and to a degree, it does exonerate Donald Trump. Let's bring in CNN senior justice correspondent Evan Perez. Evan, what exactly did Durham find in this report?
Well, Jake, the bottom line finding from John Durham's 4-year investigation is that the FBI moved very quickly to investigate these allegations of connections of collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, and that they did so by ignoring a lot of evidence that would have led them to drop that altogether.
Happens just 2 weeks before massive change in Ukraine. On May 20th, Volodymyr Zelensky, an actor and comedian, is inaugurated as president of Ukraine. He pledges to fight corruption in his country, but Zelensky has another problem: a continued costly war with Russia over large swaths of land. Zelensky needs U.S. military aid and also clear back.
As we've been discussing, tomorrow will be the first public hearings in the impeachment inquiry, raising the question, how did we get here? To look back and bring it all into focus are Lisa Desjardins and Yamiche Alcindor.
When I announced I was running for president, I said I believe that the core values of this nation, our very democracy, was at risk. And events in recent days have made that even clearer, not only to me, but I think to everyone. We have a president who believes there's no limit to his power. We have a president who believes he can do anything and get away with it. We have a president who believes he's above the law, pursuing the leader of another nation to investigate a political opponent to help win his election is not the conduct of an American president.
In May, President Trump has the ambassador of Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, abruptly removed from that job.
But you specifically recall Burisma.
Yes.
All right. Out of thousands of companies in the Ukraine, the only one that you recall the Obama-Biden State Department preparing you to answer questions about was the one where the vice president's son was on the board. Is that fair?
Yes.
A lot of the Ukraine charges about you have been debunked and were unfair. There's one thing that a lot of Democrats even do wonder about, and that is Hunter Biden, your son, was getting paid a lot of money to serve on the board of a Ukrainian energy company facing serious corruption charges. You were the vice president running point on Ukraine. The average Joe hears that and says, that sounds fishy. What's your understanding of what your son was doing for an extraordinary amount of money?
I don't know what he was doing. I know he was on the board. I found out he was on the board after he was on the board, and that was it.
FBI informant file containing a $10 million bribery allegation against President Biden and his son was released Thursday. Mykola Zlochevsky, the owner of a natural gas company, Burisma Holdings, told the FBI informant in 2016 while meeting at a coffee shop in Vienna that it cost $5 million to pay one Biden and $5 million to another Biden, according to a redacted FD 1023 form. Zlochevsky allegedly claimed to have 17 recordings of conversations with the Bidens, 2 of which involved Joe, as well as many text messages and documents that are understood to be financial records of payments to the Bidens.
And in that process, and because that process was set up, they developed the information that is now in controversy, this 1023, and it did not, in my recollection, come from Giuliani, as Mr. Raskin suggests. It was stuff that was developed within the department and the FBI from confidential human source. And that information was checked out, and it was determined that it was not likely to have been disinformation. It doesn't say whether it's true or not, but it wasn't no sign that it was disinformation. And so it was provided to the ongoing investigation in Delaware to follow up on and to check out. Now, I understand a lot of Republicans are very frustrated because that investigation in Delaware has been going on for 4.5 years. It was going on for 2 years under me, and now another 2.5 years. And, you know, a lot of damage is being done to the country and to the department because of the silence and the failure to reach a decision. I think it's time to fish or cut bait and find out what actually happened in that investigation.
Burisma is not a humanitarian group.
Private energy corporation.
For-profit gas company. Why do they have a formal MOU? Why are there USAID emails saying that we are supporting Burisma? You've got USAID funding Burisma. You have these CIA connections completely all over it. Hunter Biden himself was on the board of the National Democratic Institute, which is the DNC branch of the CIA's most notorious cutout, the National Endowment for Democracy. So Hunter himself was running through those networks. You had Cover Black also on the board of directors of Burisma. Cover Black spent 30 years at the CIA. He won a CIA Distinguished Medal Award. He was Mitt Romney's Sherpa to the intelligence community when Mitt Romney was running for president against Obama. So he was the guy who got the CIA to back Mitt Romney's presidency. You have a longtime CIA major power player right on the board, just like Hunter Biden was, of Burisma. You have the Atlantic Council with a formal partnership with Burisma. The Atlantic Council has 7 CIA directors on its board. They signed that partnership agreement with Burisma on January 19th, 2017, one day before Trump was inaugurated.
Wow. Mike Benz, how is he remembering all that stuff? That's what I'm going to ask him on the show tomorrow.
There's nobody... Well, you've had a lot of time. Isn't this something you want to get to the bottom of?
No, because I trust my son.
But that doesn't pass the smell test. Like, when you're vice president, isn't there a higher standard? Don't you need to know what's happening with your family? Don't you need to put down some guardrails?
Unless there was something that was... there was something on its face that was wrong. There's nothing on its face that was wrong. So look, if you want to talk about problems, you know, let's talk about Trump's family. I mean, come on. This is...
So...
These guys are amazing.
So you think that everything that happened was kosher?
You know there's not one single bit of evidence, not one little tiny bit, to suggest anything done was wrong. You know that. But you keep asking me these questions. It's okay. You're doing what you have to do. But I'm not worried about it. Look, the American public knows me.
Last one on this. So you're...
This 30-minute phone call might become one of the most important moments in American history. Let's back up a month before the call. Congress had approved $391 million in military aid to Ukraine to help them defend against Russia. But Trump told his staff to withhold that money. He wanted to talk to Zelensky first.
Congratulations on a great victory.
After sharing pleasantries, Trump quickly changed the subject. He alluded to the billions of dollars in military aid the U.S. has given Ukraine in the last few years.
The United States has been very, very good to Ukraine. I wouldn't say that it's reciprocal necessarily, because things are happening that are not good. But the United States has been very, very good to Ukraine.
I wouldn't say it's reciprocal. In other words, Ukraine owed him something.
Yes, you are absolutely right.
Zelensky then told Trump he's ready to cooperate.
We're ready to continue to cooperate for the next steps. I would like you to do us a favor, though.
Trump ran through a few requests, and then he got to this one.
There's a lot of talk about Biden's son.
Let's pause here. At the time of the call, Joe Biden was the leading candidate to run against Trump in 2020. Polls from just before the call show voters preferred Biden to Trump by a wide margin. When he picked up the phone to call Zelensky, Joe Biden was a huge threat to Trump's re-election. That's why what he said next is so important.
Whatever you can do with the Attorney General would be great. If you can look into it, it sounds horrible to me.
This is a witch hunt at the highest level, and it's so bad for our country.
And this is what he was saying, and he's absolutely right, is that the promise when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and this was verbally promised and put in writing, was that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. And NATO at that point, the line then was through Germany, right? Like the western half of Germany was in the west, and the eastern half was with the Soviet Union. And they were like, we'll let all of these nations, secede, and the Soviet Union will collapse, and we're giving up on communism. It was one of the greatest things that ever happened. And the deal was, okay, you do that, then we won't move NATO. We won't move our military alliance into your area that used to be your realm of influence. And every single president since then has moved NATO east to the point that NATO is now on Russia's border. And in Ukraine, even though they didn't officially join NATO, there was always talk of it. Kamala Harris, right before the start of the war, said we're looking to put Ukraine into NATO. And they put under George W. Bush, they put in Poland these dual-use rocket launchers. There's a big complaint that Vladimir Putin has that he's like these can be used to get nukes here in a matter of minutes. Like this is like a threat to us that we cannot tolerate. And then the other thing to this, right, that's important to add is, like, you remember the two big things that it's so weird no one, like, at least in the larger conversation, I don't see anyone connecting these things, is that there's two things, like, involving Ukraine that were very big, that happened very recently in American history, that very much connect to this war. And one is that our last president was impeached over a thing with Ukraine. And, like, what was that? And then the other thing is the current president's son was getting paid millions of dollars from a company, Burisma, in Ukraine. And these things all connect. And basically what happened was, after the 2014 coup, this company, Burisma, and by the way, Matt Taibbi has done incredible reporting on this. I highly recommend everyone read his stuff, his Substacks. Incredible.
Yeah, he's fantastic.
Unbelievable. But so basically, Burisma was in bed with the old government that had allied with Russia. And so when this government was overthrown, they were very worried. Because they were like, oh, we were in bed with the old government, and now there's this new government who's in there. And so instead of bribing the new government, they just went right to the source and bribed the son of the sitting vice president. Joe Biden, when he was vice president, was in charge of Ukraine policy. Oh, my God. So they just went, that was why they put him there. And then they put some other, like, CIA guy or something like that on their board. They just...
Trump has this theory about Joe Biden, and it has to do with his son, Hunter. Back in 2014, Hunter took a cushy job at a Ukrainian gas company, Burisma. As it turns out, the British were investigating the owner of that same company for money laundering, and they asked Ukraine's top prosecutor, Viktor Shokin, to pursue this case, because investigating corruption was his job. But Shokin ignored them, and Burisma's owner was never prosecuted. It wasn't the first time Shokin had failed to investigate corruption, and people in Ukraine were fed up.
Activists, MPs, and ordinary citizens have come together to demand the resignation of the Prosecutor General, Viktor Shokin.
We don't believe even that this prosecution can be reformed, because it doesn't exist.
They weren't alone. 8 senators, including 3 Republicans, signed a letter calling for urgent reforms in the Prosecutor General's office. Basically, a bunch of people were pushing for Shokin to go, including the Obama administration, who sent Biden to deal with it.
And I went over, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kyiv, and I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Oh, son of a bitch. Got fired.
Ukraine's embattled Prosecutor General Viktor Shokin is no longer in office.
But in the call with the Ukrainian president, Trump hinted that Shokin was fired for a different reason.
I heard you had a prosecutor who was very good, and he was shut down, and that's really unfair.
Then Trump explained why he thought Joe Biden might have been behind Shokin's dismissal.
There's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution. So if you can look into it, it sounds horrible to me.
Alright, so what's the favor Trump is asking for here? It looks like he's asking Zelensky for some proof that Joe Biden pushed to get Shokin fired to protect Hunter. Which doesn't even make sense, because Shokin was fired in part for not investigating Burisma.
Narrow the focus a bit and delve into his dealings with a shady Ukrainian energy firm. Because for a story that on the whole is still pretty murky, this part of the story is actually pretty clear. Back in 2014, Hunter Biden took a paid position on the board of Burisma Holdings, a large natural gas producer in Ukraine. The company said they were bringing in Biden to help with, quote, transparency, corporate governance, and responsibility, which seems pretty ironic in hindsight. Even the president's most loyal backers would probably concede that bringing in Hunter Biden to help with responsibility is akin to seeking Will Smith's advice on how to take a joke. He had never done any work involving either the energy industry or Ukraine. What expertise he did have was in areas like lobbying and hedge fund management, so it paled in comparison to existing Burisma board members. And yet, Hunter Biden was being paid as much as $1 million a year for a job that was far from a full-time gig. A little less than $1 million. But the obvious question here is why? What was Burisma paying Hunter Biden so much money for?
Idea that he would use the pardon power to protect his closest family member. And not, by the way, you've all seen the pardon now. It is truly sweeping. It sweeps in all of his Ukrainian activity. It sweeps in all of his foreign dealings. It is stunning. This, let's be honest, Hunter Biden would be in prison already if he didn't have the name Biden.
And so for him to come out and to talk about that this was a witch hunt when clearly it could be argued that's exactly what you were doing to Donald Trump, or you assisted in doing, seems beyond hypocritical. And that was what disgusted me. It wasn't his decision. It wasn't him pardoning his son. It was the weak, pathetic explanation that he gave, which has most critics just shaking their heads and raising their eyebrows and saying, what nerve you have.
If I were he, I would pardon Trump.
You know something? Honestly,
I would say,
honestly,
this
as
has gotta
crazy as this
stop.
sounds, Chris,
Chris,
that's exactly what I would do. That's exactly what I would do. Enough's enough. You know what? You're the Democrats. You lost the election. You got your butt whipped. You couldn't prevent him from going back to the White House. More than a dozen cases have been dropped against him. The cases that have been ruled against him, he's going to appeal, and he'll probably get off from having to deal with all of that. It's time to move forward. You want to get at Trump? Sit back and judge what he does.
Right around that time, in mid-July, the United States freezes $391 million in aid to Ukraine. Several witnesses testify they were told this was by order of the president, directed through Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney.
Ariel, first things first.
Mulvaney hasn't commented on that idea, but has ardently defended the president.
And I have news for everybody. Get over it. There's going to be political influence in foreign policy.
A newly revealed email from 2015 shows what Hunter Biden's, quote, ultimate purpose was with the Ukrainian company Burisma. All right, Lauren, take us through it.
This was an email from Burisma executive to Hunter when Hunter was on its board. And this is what it reads. Pull it up. Quote, the scope of work should also include organization of a visit of a number of widely recognized and influential current and or former U.S. policymakers to Ukraine in November, with the ultimate purpose to close down for any cases or pursuits against the Burisma president Nikolai in Ukraine. Well, that influential policymaker was Vice President Joe Biden, Ashley, and he did go to Kyiv 1 month after that email, and he threatened to withhold $1 billion in U.S. aid if Ukraine's top prosecutor investigating that Burisma executive was not fired. Some Republicans are calling that clear proof of extortion and bribery.
Yeah, the evidence is mounting, no doubt. Lauren, thank you very much.
That email suggests Hunter Biden brokered a meeting between his father and a Burisma executive. And that email has now been verified by the Washington Post. The Joe Biden camp has repeatedly denied that a meeting ever took place. And this is the inherent problem with conflicts of interest. Because the president's son had this position for which he was woefully underqualified with a company with lots of skeletons in the closet, based in a country where his father had an active foreign policy role. Hunter Biden was basically handing an engraved invitation to his father's critics to want to know more.
Everyone says this war, the word they use over and over and over again, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Hillary Clinton, all of them, unprovoked. Vladimir Putin led an unprovoked war in Ukraine. But then, it's just like with Osama bin Laden, what they did with him then. Don't listen to him. Whatever you do, don't listen to what he's actually saying, because none of that's his motivations. Like, what his motivations are what we tell you. Osama bin Laden hates us because we're free. And then, like, Ron Paul would just go like, yeah, but that's not what he's saying at all.
Thousands of workers in our state are bracing for layoffs at one of Connecticut's largest employers.
Raytheon announced 15,000 workers at Pratt & Whitney and Collins Aerospace will be cut. Channel 3 Eyewitness News reporter Caitlin Nuclo is live this morning at Pratt & Whitney in East Hartford. So, Caitlin, what do we know this morning?
Well, the company says the lack of travel right now is hurting their bottom line. They do have locations, though, around the country. So many this morning are still anxiously waiting to hear how many layoffs will be happening here in Connecticut. This news may have caught people by surprise because back in July, Raytheon announced plans for 8,500 layoffs, and now that number has nearly doubled. The pandemic has airports empty, and that has grounded many aircraft companies. Raytheon, which merged with United Technologies earlier this year, announced the decline in air travel is triggering 15,000 layoffs spread between Pratt & Whitney and Collins Aerospace. Both have locations around the country, so we still don't know how many people will lose their job here. But University of New Haven economics professor Brian Marks predicts it will only get worse.
Raytheon's announcement suggesting that they may not see a return of the commercial airline aspect of their business until 2023 is not a surprise.
Pleased that the work that Senator Hartley has done as a co-chair of the Commerce Committee to really continue to position Connecticut as a leader for high-tech, high-skill, high-paying jobs. She has worked tirelessly in order to advance Connecticut's place in the bioscience industry, personalized medicine, microbiome areas, really with collaborations with Yale, Mount Sinai, and University of Connecticut. So these are really important things that she's been doing. So we've highlighted a number of bills that Senator Hartley will talk about through this work that, again, sometimes doesn't always make headlines in the news, but is very important to position Connecticut over the next generation or two as a place to grow jobs, to grow our tax base, and to welcome in those high-tech, high-skill jobs that are so important to our economy.
Dude, this thing with Russia is just like the craziest thing in the world. Like the idea that we're actually flirting with a nuclear conflict with Russia is the most important priority in the history of humanity, is that America and Russia do not go to war. There's nothing more important than that. That's it. We'll destroy the human species if we do this. And yet there's this war right on Russia's border, and there's no effort to negotiate going on. There's like no effort. In fact, from very solid reporting that actually America, through Boris Johnson, told Ukraine not to negotiate with Russia at the very beginning of the war when they had a deal worked out. They had a deal worked out. There's been reported in multiple sources that they had a deal worked out, and the deal was basically that Vladimir Putin would pull back. He would pull back his troops and leave Ukraine under the condition that the very simple conditions that Ukraine guaranteed autonomy for the Donbass region and agreed to never join NATO. And like that was a deal. Like, okay, I'm not saying everyone thinks that's the perfect deal, but it's better than what we got right now. It's
better than nuclear war.
It was as sudden as it was brutal and relentless. Ukrainians woke up to find themselves plunged into the midst of war. Explosions and air raid sirens ringing out here in Kyiv and cities across this country as Russia launched a full-scale invasion on multiple fronts in the early hours of this morning, firing missiles at key military infrastructure sites. This evening, its troops are reported to be advancing from the north onto Kyiv.